How can we use the seerah as an example for handling and dealing with grief? As Sheikh Hasib mentioned, the Prophet Muhammad SAW losing not just his emotional, dependent with Khadija, but the physical protection with, Abu Talib. How can one cope with grief? We'll go with Ustadha Dalia Mogahed then.
Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على نبينا Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Bismillah. I think that this question is incredibly important because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about grief and about the pious way to handle grief. What we learn from the seerah is that Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam processed and felt his emotions, and at the same time showed us that grieving doesn't mean complaining, doesn't mean rejecting God's decree, but it also doesn't mean suppressing the natural human response to tragedy. We know that he cried when his son died. We know that he expressed, sadness, that his heart felt sad, that he shed tears, and yet he was the closest human being ever to exist to Allah. So the idea that piety means this sort of stoicism whereby we don't shed tears, we don't express sadness, is something that we really have to challenge and correct.
Yes, I agree with that, mainly because I think there's a tendency in certain, I think, part of our cultures to not see men sharing emotions in many ways. And I think it becomes also a semblance of a stigma as well. In fact, when we teach a seminar on relationships with licensed marriage family therapists, one of the topics that comes up is how men can share healthily their emotions and articulate them. You find sometimes the words are not even used, and men don't even know which words to use. But you find in the Prophet ﷺ, he was very much in tune with that and shared with it. In fact, to the point that when he kissed one of his children, once a man said, "Do you kiss your children?" He says, "This is mercy from Allah. Allah placed in the hearts of people, and if somebody does not, essentially they don't have no share of that mercy." The man was surprised, and he said, "I have 10 children, I haven't even kissed them." So that element of the stigma of men sharing emotion, or like you said, something is very natural, you see that it was also a problem in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it kind of extends even to this day. It's a very important point, which is Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the perfect human before he was essentially a prophet. So that perfection is also to exemplify that during grief, it is completely okay to grieve. It's a whole year. It's called the year of, I remember Dr. Omar Mahmoud, he said something very beautiful. And he's a psychologist. He said, you can say another translation for Am al-Huzn is the year of depression, the year where he went through a whole year it took him to grieve and to overcome. And a lot of people, I think, don't understand the difference between mourning and grieving. So because we become very kind of boxed in the legality of what it means to mourn and grieve and the language, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not forbid us from taking our time to overcome loss. But we are directed to not be emotionally shackled or imprisoned by the feeling of having lost somebody. There's a famous statement in Bukhari where a woman lost her husband, essentially. And what she did is she built a tent on top of his grave in Baqi' in Medina. For an entire year, she's like mourning him. And finally, after a year, what happens is she leaves. And they said they hear a voice. Nobody really knows what that voice was. Was it jinn? Was it angels? Whatever it was. And it recited a line of poetry. And that line of poetry was, a year passed, and then what have you gained from it? Meaning they just left back and went to their homes after they felt they overcame the loss and the grief. So the idea being is that we don't show this overt nature of lamenting and mourning and wailing, but at the same time, the process of grief, the Prophet had an entire year in his life where it was such a him overcoming that. And he never forgot it, in essence. He would still go visit the friends of Khadija radiallahu anha. He would still remember her. He would still say, she did this for me and she did that for me. So subhanAllah, that process of losing a loved one is something that stays with you for a very long time. I'm interested to hear from you. And in this stage of the Prophet ﷺ's life, what would you think is are some like practical ways that we can see if a person is genuinely mourning a loss, how is it that we can learn from the Prophet ﷺ to get over that particular moment in their life?
That's a hard question, but I'll try to contribute a little bit to it, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts as well. A few things that we know about Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam is he surrounded himself with people who cared about him. He was not a loner. He had sahaba. And I think this idea of suhba salihah, is incredibly important so that we can get through life, so that we can get through hardships. So surrounding ourselves with people who love us, who care about us, who check on us, is very important. Another thing we know, and I'll be talking a little bit more about this when I cover Ta'if, is he dug in and really tapped into the power of the Quran for solace. He would recite certain ayahs from the Quran that gave him comfort. You mentioned the beautiful Surah Yusuf and Surah Maryam that were revealed during a time as a balm, as a comfort to Rasulullah. And we know that Surah Yusuf, reciting Surah Yusuf, reflecting on Surah Yusuf, is something that's recommended during times of grief. So to tap into the power, the healing power, and the meaning of the Quran as a balm for the heart are two practical things that we know Rasulullah did to get through grief.
It's beautiful, mashallah. And I think that actually hits pretty much what we've studied in seerah, the same. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam sought comfort in others. He never like isolated himself. So life would still move on, and the love from those who he had around you kind of supported him to overcome the grief of having loss of loved ones. There's also actually even statements from the Prophet ﷺ in terms of actual, you could say soul food and types of medicine that essentially helped people. So there's one which specifically mentioned that it's called talbina in the hadith, which the Prophet ﷺ said at that time helped for sorrow or grief. So you could see that even treating with ailment is something very present in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ for people who are grieving or finding sadness or a sense of anxiety. So you see all three of those layers present. You have the physical presence of companionship, you have the spiritual element, we could say spiritual counseling, and then you have the time it takes for you to get over that particular loss in any ways. And you see this in the life of the Prophet ﷺ present anytime he would lose somebody, that he would take advantage of all of these elements and would not just be somebody that says, oh, just read the Quran and that's enough. But these three elements are all something that are part and parcel of what helped the Prophet ﷺ process and overcome that grief. And then we also want to be careful of not like over exaggerating the level the Prophet ﷺ faced that grief. But at the same time, we understand that the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam gave us very practical, even du'as for people who are facing anxiety or even a sense of depression or sadness. They're having suicidal thoughts. There's a du'a for that. Prophet ﷺ says, if you see that life is good for me, then allow me to live. And if you see that death is good for me, then allow me to pass away, not having fitna in my deen. So there's an array of du'as for all of these different situations, like you mentioned beautifully. Jazakumullah khair.